Hi, it's Maria from Still Dreaming Homestead, and it's time for the next chapter in our book. Our book is Farmer Boy by Laura Ingalls Wilder. Turn of the year. The days were growing longer, but the cold was more intense. Father said, when the days begin to lengthen, the cold begins to strengthen. At last the snow softened a little on the south and west slopes. At noon the icicles dripped. Sap was rising into the trees, and it was time to make sugar. In the cold mornings, just before sunrise, Almanzo and Father set out to the maple grove. Father had a large wooden yoke on his shoulder, like I showed you for the calves. And Almanzo had a little yoke. From the ends of the yokes hung strips of moose wood bark with large iron hooks in them, and a big wooden bucket swung from each hook. In every maple tree, Father had bored or drilled a small hole and fitted a little wooden spout into it. Sweet maple sap was dripping from the spouts into the small pails. Going from tree to tree, Almanzo emptied the sap into his big buckets. The weight hung from his shoulders, but he steadied the buckets with his hands to keep them from swinging. When they were full, he went to the great cauldron and emptied them into it. So that would be like a big pot. The large cauldron hung from a pole set between two trees. Father kept a bonfire blazing under it to boil the sap. Almanzo loved trudging through the frozen wild woods. He walked on snow that had never been walked on before, and only his tracks followed behind him. Busily, he emptied the little pails into the buckets, and whenever he was thirsty, he drank some of the thin, sweet, icy cold sap. He liked to go back to the roaring fire. He poked at it and saw sparks fly. He warmed his face and hands in the scorching heat and smelled the boiling sap. Then he went into the woods again. At noon, all the sap was boiling in the cauldron. Father opened the lunch pail, and Almanzo sat on the log beside him. They ate and talked. A pile of logs was at their backs. All around them were snow and ice and wild woods, but they were snug and cozy. After they had eaten, Father stayed by the fire to watch the sap, but Almanzo hunted wintergreen berries. Under the snow in the south slopes, the bright red berries were ripe among the thick yellow leaves. Almanzo took off his mittens and pawed at the snow with his bare hands. He found the red clusters and filled his mouth full. The cold berries crunched between his teeth, gushing out their aromatic juice. So that they smelled very good. Nothing else was ever so good as wintergreen berries dug out of the snow. Almanzo's clothes were covered with snow. His fingers were stiff and red with cold, but he never left the south slope until he had pawed all over. When the sun was low behind the maple trunks, Father threw some snow on the fire, and it died in sizzles and steam. Then Father dipped the hot syrup into buckets. He and Almanzo set their shoulders under the yokes again and carried the buckets home. They poured the syrup into Mother's big brass kettle on the cook stove. Then Almanzo began the chores while Father fetched the rest of the syrup from the woods. After supper, the syrup was ready to sugar off. Mother ladled it into 6-quart milk pans, so that would be 1.5 gallons, and left it to cool. In the morning, every pan held a big cake of solid maple sugar. Mother dumped out the round golden brown cakes and stored them on the top pantry shelves. Day after day the sap was running, and every morning Almanzo went with Father to gather and boil it. Every night Mother sugared it off. They made all the sugar they could use the next year. Then the last boiling of syrup was sugared off. It was stored in jugs down in the cellar, and that was the year's syrup. When Alice came home from school, she smelled Almanzo and she cried out, "Oh, you've been eating wild wintergreen berries." She thought it wasn't fair. She had to go to school while Almanzo gathered sap and ate wintergreen berries. She said, "Boys have all the fun." She made Almanzo promise that he wouldn't touch the south slopes along the Trout River beyond the sheep pasture. So on Saturdays they went together to paw over those slopes. When Almanzo found a red cluster, he yelled. And when Alice found one, she squealed. And sometimes they divided, and sometimes they didn't. But they went on their hands and knees all over those south slopes, and they ate wintergreen berries all afternoon. Almanzo brought home a pailful of the thick green leaves, and Almanzo crammed them into a big bottle. Mother filled the bottle with whiskey and set it away. That was her wintergreen flavoring for the cakes and cookies. That's how you make extracts, like vanilla extract. All that good flavor goes out into the alcohol. And then when you cook with it, all the alcohol burns off, so you're not going to get drunk. Every day the snow was melting a little. The cedars and spruces shook it off and it fell in big blobs from the bare branches of oaks and maples and beeches. All along the walls of the barn and house the snow was pitted with water falling from the icicles. And finally the icicles fell crashing. The earth showed in wet, dark patches here and there. The patches spread. Only the trodden patches were still white, and a little snow remained on the north sides of the building and the woodpiles. Then the winter term of school ended and spring had come. One morning Father drove to Malone. Before noon he came hurrying back and shouted news from the buggy. The New York potato buyers were in town. Royal ran to help hitch the team to the wagon, and Alice and Almanzo ran to get bushel baskets from the woodshed. They rolled them bumpity-bump down the cedar stairs and began filling them with potatoes as fast as they could. There they are right there. They filled 2 baskets before Father drove the wagon to the kitchen porch. Then the race began. Father and Royal hurried the baskets upstairs and dumped them into the wagon, and Almanzo and Alice hurried to fill more baskets. Faster and faster they were carried away. Almanzo tried to fill more baskets than Alice, but he couldn't. She worked so fast she was turning back to the bin while her hoop skirts were still whirling the other way. When she pushed back her curls, her hands left smudges on her cheeks, because you don't wash the potatoes before you store them, because that could make them go bad. So they still have dust from being in the ground. Almanzo laughed at her dirty face, and she laughed at him. "Look at yourself in the glass." That means a mirror. "You're dirtier than I be." They kept the baskets full. Father and Royal never had to wait. When the wagon was full, Father drove away in a hurry. It was mid-afternoon before he came back, but Royal and Almanzo and Alice filled the wagon again while he ate some cold dinner. And he hauled away another load. That night, Alice helped Royal and Almanzo do the chores. Father would not be there for supper. He did not come before bedtime. So that's one of the ways they made money, was selling potatoes. Just a second. He did not come before bedtime. Royal sat up to wait for him. Late in the night, Almanzo heard the wagon, and Royal went to help Father curry and brush the tired horses who had done 20 miles of hauling that day. The next morning and the next, they all began loading by candlelight, and Father was gone with the first load before sunrise. Wow, that is a lot of potatoes they must have had. On the third day, the potato train left for New York City, but all Father's potatoes were on it. 500 bushels at $1 a bushel. He said to Mother at supper, "I told you when potatoes were cheap last fall, they'd be high in the spring." That was $500 in the bank. They were all proud of Father, who raised good potatoes and knew so well when to store and when to sell them. Here's my clock. "That's pretty good," Mother said, beaming. They all felt happy. But later Mother said, "Well, now that that's off our hands, we'll start house cleaning tomorrow, bright and early." Almanzo hated house cleaning. He had to pull up carpet tacks around the edges of miles of carpet. Then they tacked them to the floor so they didn't move. Then the carpets were hung on clotheslines outdoors, and he had to beat them with a long stick. When he was little, he had run under the carpets, playing they were tents. But now he was 9 years old, and he had to beat those carpets without stopping, till no more dust would come out of them. Everything in the house was moved. Everything was scrubbed. Well, let me tell you something. Now, if you have a carpet, you will just vacuum it. But they didn't have a vacuum. They could sweep them. That left a lot of dirt in them. That's why they had to beat them with a stick. Everything in the house was moved. Everything was scrubbed and scoured and polished. They call that spring cleaning. All the curtains were down. All the feather beds were outdoors airing. All the blankets and quilts were washed. From dawn till dark, Almanzo was running, pumping water, fetching wood, spreading clean straw on the scrubbed floors, and then helping to stretch the carpets over it, and then tacking down those edges again. Days and days he spent in the cellar. He helped Royal empty the vegetable bins. They sorted out every spoiled apple and carrot and turnip and put back the good ones into the few bins that Mother had scrubbed. They didn't have refrigerators, remember. They took down the other bins and stored them in the woodshed. They carried out crocks and jars and jugs till the cellar was almost empty. Then Mother scrubbed the walls and the floor. Royal poured water into pails of lime, and Almanzo stirred the lime till it stopped boiling, and then it was whitewash. Then they whitewashed the whole cellar. That was fun. "Mercy on us," Mother said when they came upstairs. "Did you get as much whitewash on the cellar as you got on yourselves?" The whole cellar was fresh and clean and snow white when it dried. Mother moved her milk pails down to the scrubbed shelves. The butter tubs were scored white with sand and dried in the sun. Almanzo set them in a row on the clean cellar floor to be filled with the summer's butter. Outdoors, the lilacs and snowball bushes were in bloom. Violets and buttercups were blossoming in the green pastures. Birds were building their nests, and it was time to work in the fields. So that was what it was like at the turn of the year. So the turn of the year wasn't what we would call New Year's Day. It was when spring was beginning. So It's Maria from Still Dreaming Homestead. I love you. I really do. And I want to pray blessings on you and yours, in your house, out of your house, in the day and the night. Whatever you do, keep dreaming. Bye-bye.